the day Mabel Hurst sent her seventh bride out to the Abbott ranch. She did it with the quiet certainty of a woman who had already lost 6 times, and was beginning to suspect that Perry Abbott was not a man who could be matched, but a man who could only be met. It was the autumn of 1878 in Colton Creek, Texas, a small but stubborn town that had grown up around a watering hole and a cattle trail the way such places did, without permission and without apology. The land around it was wide and golden and punishing, full of mesquite and red dust, and the kind of silence that pressed against a person like a second skin. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, dragging with it a general store, a telegraph office, a Methodist church with a leaking roof, and a woman named Mabel Hurst who ran her matchmaking enterprise from the back room of the dry goods shop with the efficiency of a quartermaster and the optimism of a preacher. Mabel was 61 years old, wide through the hips, sharp through the eyes, and had successfully married off 34 couples in the 5 years since she had arrived in Colton Creek. She had matched widows and widowers, ranchers and schoolteachers, drifters who had found religion and farmers who had lost everything but their pride. She was, by her own estimate and the general consensus of the town, very good at what she did. Perry Abbott was her only failure, not for lack of trying. Mabel had sent him Martha Gale, a sensible woman of 26 from San Antonio who had survived a hard first marriage and was ready, she said, for a quieter life. Perry had met her at the door of his ranch house, listened politely while she introduced herself, and said with genuine regret that he did not think he was the right man for her, and that she would be better served finding someone in town. Martha had not argued. She had taken the wagon back to Colton Creek the same afternoon. After Martha came Helen Pruitt, a schoolteacher's daughter from Dallas who was 24 and had lovely handwriting and a talent for cooking. Perry had let her stay 2 nights, which Mabel considered progress. On the 3rd morning, Helen appeared at Mabel's door with her traveling trunk and a look of philosophical resignation. "He is very kind," Helen said, "but he does not want a wife. He wants to be left alone. You cannot match a man to solitude, Mrs. Hurst." Mabel had considered this deeply, and then ignored it and sent Rebecca Olson the following spring. Rebecca was followed by Clara Winfield, who was followed by Nora Abernathy, who was followed by a woman who went only by her first name, Josephine, and who came back from the Abbott ranch in a fury that impressed even Mabel, who thought she had seen every variety of disappointed woman the West could produce. "He is polite," Josephine said, standing in the middle of Mabel's back room with her hat still on and her gloves still buttoned. "He is perfectly, absolutely, infuriatingly polite. He thanks you for coming. He offers you coffee. He tells you that you deserve better than a man like him and that the ranch is no place for a woman of your qualities. And then he just waits. He waits until you run out of things to say, and then he says goodbye, and you find yourself in the wagon before you have entirely decided to leave." Mabel had made a note. "Abbott does not argue. He outlasts." She had pinned that note to the wall above her writing desk and stared at it for 3 months before the answer came to her. The answer came in the form of a letter. The letter was from a woman in Abilene named Anna Bailey, who was 24 years old and had heard about Mabel Hurst through a cousin who had been matched by Mabel to a cattle driver the previous year. Anna's letter was different from the letters Mabel usually received. Most women wrote about what they were looking for: steadiness, a good Christian character, a sound house, a man who did not drink too much or hit. Anna Bailey's letter was shorter than most and said almost nothing about what she wanted. Instead, it described what she was. She was a woman who had grown up on her father's cattle ranch outside Abilene and had run it alone for 2 years after his death when she was 22. She had sold it, she said, not because she could not manage it, but because managing it alone had taught her that a person could be capable of almost anything and still be profoundly lonely. She wanted a life that was hard in the way that honest things are hard. She wanted land. She wanted work. She was not afraid of either. She did not ask for a gentle man. She asked for a real one. Mabel read the letter twice, then read it a third time. She picked up her pen. Anna Bailey arrived in Colton Creek on a Thursday in late October 1878 on the afternoon train, carrying a single trunk and a canvas bag that clinked when she set it down. She was not what Mabel had pictured, though Mabel was not entirely sure what she had pictured. Anna Bailey was of medium height, with dark brown hair pinned back in a practical arrangement that had partially surrendered to the journey. Her eyes were a clear, steady gray, the color of sky before rain, and she had the kind of face that did not announce itself but revealed itself gradually, the way a landscape does when you have been standing in it long enough to stop looking past it. She wore a plain brown traveling dress that had been mended at one cuff, and she shook Mabel's hand with a firm grip and said, "Thank you for the letter, Mrs. Hurst. Tell me about the man." Mabel liked her immediately and completely. They sat in the back room with coffee, and Mabel told her about Perry Abbott with the practiced honesty of someone who had stopped sugarcoating this particular case after the second rejection. Perry was 30 years old. He had come to Colton Creek 6 years ago from somewhere in Missouri, though he did not talk much about that. He had bought 40 acres of difficult land west of town that most people thought was not worth the price he paid for it, and had, over the subsequent years, turned it into a working cattle ranch through what appeared to be a combination of stubbornness, physical endurance, and an almost frightening willingness to do whatever the land required of him. He kept 2 ranch hands, a grizzled old man named Walt Greer who had been with him since the beginning, and a younger man, barely 20, named Eli whose last name nobody seemed to know or need. The ranch ran about 120 head of cattle, raised some horses, and produced enough income that Perry Abbott was considered prosperous by Colton Creek standards, which meant he was not in debt and his roof did not leak. He was well liked in town. He came in for supplies once a week, was never rude, helped his neighbors when there was trouble, and had once ridden 40 miles in a single night to help find a rancher's missing child, which the town had not forgotten. He went to church occasionally, not regularly. He did not drink to excess. He did not gamble. He had no enemies that Mabel knew of, though she thought there might be some history in Missouri that was nobody's business but his own. What he did not do was let anyone in, not in any lasting way. He was like a house with all the shutters open and all the doors locked, and the women Mabel had sent him had all come back with the same bewildered description of warmth that led nowhere and courtesy that was somehow more discouraging than coldness. Anna Bailey listened to all of this without interrupting. When Mabel finished, Anna was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee. "What happened to him?" she said. Mabel paused. "I beg your pardon." "A man doesn't build walls like that because he was born with them. Something happened to him." Anna looked up. "Do you know what?" Mabel did not know, not precisely. There were rumors, there always were in a town this size, that Perry had been married before, briefly, back in Missouri. That something had ended badly, but nobody knew the truth of it and Perry had never offered it. Anna nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll go out to meet him tomorrow." "I should tell you," Mabel said carefully, "that the other women, all of them, came back the same day or within 2 or 3 days. He is very good at making a person feel as though leaving is the reasonable choice." Anna looked at her with those gray eyes that were perfectly still. "I'm sure he is," she said, "but I'm not in the habit of making the reasonable choice when the right one is available." Mabel drove Anna out to the Abbott ranch herself the next morning in her buckboard, because she wanted to see it with her own eyes. The drive west was about 6 miles through open grassland that had gone tawny and dry with the season, the sky above it enormous and pale blue and empty. As they crested the last low ridge, the ranch came into view, a solid stone and timber house, a barn that was better built than most houses in the territory, corrals with good fence lines, and beyond them the long brown sweep of grazing land dotted with cattle. Anna sat very straight beside her on the buckboard seat and looked at the ranch for a long moment without speaking. "It's good land," she said finally, with the quiet authority of someone who had been raised on similar ground and knew how to read it. "He worked hard for it. Perry Abbott was coming out of the barn when they pulled up to the yard. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and a lean, weathered quality about him that the plains made in people over time. The sun had darkened his skin to a warm brown, and his hair was the color of dark timber. He wore a work shirt and canvas trousers and a hat that had seen years of service, and he moved with the unhurried, economical grace of a man who had learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. He stopped when he saw the buckboard, and something crossed his face, not quite resignation, but the careful composure of someone who had been preparing for something they would rather not do. He came forward anyway, because Perry Abbott was nothing if not polite. "Morning, Mrs. Hurst," he said, touching his hat brim. "Morning, Perry," Mabel said. She nodded toward Anna. "This is Miss Anna Bailey. She's come from Abilene." Perry's eyes moved to Anna. He looked at her with a calm, measured attention that was entirely courteous and entirely guarded. "Miss Bailey," he said, "welcome to the ranch." He paused just slightly. "I'll get Walt to see to your horse." This was, Mabel recognized, the opening move, the gracious hospitality that would eventually, smoothly, deposit the guest back in the wagon and send her on her way. Anna stepped down from the buckboard without waiting for assistance and looked at Perry Abbott with the same direct, unhurried attention he was giving her. She was a full head shorter than him, and she looked up without any trace of intimidation. "Thank you," she said. "I've heard a great deal about your ranch. I'd like to see it if you don't mind." Something shifted in Perry's expression, barely perceptible. "Of course," he said after a moment. Mabel smiled to herself. She clucked to her horse, turned the buckboard around, and drove back toward town. Perry led Anna to the house, made coffee with the brisk efficiency of a man who lived alone and had gotten very comfortable doing so, and set a cup in front of her at the kitchen table with the clean, impersonal hospitality of a hotel. The kitchen was spare but not poor good iron cookware on well-made shelves, a solid table of dark wood, 2 chairs that did not match, a window above the dry sink that looked west toward open land. It was a kitchen designed for function, not comfort, and it had the particular feel of a space that had never been argued about. "You have good water," Anna said, looking out the window. "There's a spring, isn't there, west of the main house?" Perry, who had been leaning against the counter with his own coffee cup, looked at her with the first hint of something other than careful courtesy. "There is," he said. "How did you know? The way the ground runs, and the grass is greener over that ridge than anywhere else on the approach." She looked back at him. "How long have you been running cattle here?" 5 years. "How many head?" 120. "I'm looking to add another 40 by spring if the prices hold." "What breed?" Something in Perry went still, but in a different way than before. The kind of stillness that is attention rather than withdrawal. "Mix," he said. "Mostly Longhorn, some Hereford cross I've been working with for the last 2 years. The Hereford cross does better through the dry season." "My father tried that," Anna said. "He found the cross to be hardier but slower to market weight." "That's true," Perry said, with the quiet interest of someone who had been thinking about exactly this problem. "But the survival rate through a dry summer more than compensates for the delay." He stopped himself, as if he had just noticed that he was engaged in a conversation he had not planned to have. "Bailey," he began, and his voice took on the careful, kind tone that Josephine had described so precisely, the tone that was the beginning of a courteous farewell. "I appreciate you making the journey out here, but I want to be honest with you. What happened to the northeast pasture?" Anna asked as though he had not spoken. Perry blinked. "I beg your pardon, the northeast pasture. About half a mile back on the approach, the fence line is new but the ground inside is bare. Something happened there." A pause. Perry set his coffee cup down. "Flash flood came through in August," he said, with the automatic precision of a man who cataloged damage as a matter of habit. "Got the fence and a good portion of the topsoil. I've been debating whether to reseed or leave it fallow until spring." "Leave it fallow," Anna said. "Reseeding too late in the season will just get you surface growth that doesn't hold through winter. You'll lose it again. Give it the freeze and the thaw and let it come back on its own in March. Then reseed if it needs help, but it probably won't. Perry looked at her for a long moment. That's what Walt said, he told her. Walt sounds like a sensible man. He is. Another pause, this one with a different quality. Do you want to see the barn? Anna looked up at him with those steady gray eyes and said, Yes, actually, I do. It was the barn that did something to Perry Abbott, though he could not have said exactly what. He showed her the horses first. He had 7, 4 of them working horses, and 3 he was training for sale, and Anna went to each one with a quiet confidence, running her hands along their flanks and checking their feet with the practiced ease of someone who had grown up doing exactly this. She spoke to them in a low, even voice that was not at all the cooing that some people did, but a direct, matter-of-fact address, as if the horses were colleagues rather than animals, and they responded to her with a relaxed attention that Perry found oddly notable, because 2 of those horses were notoriously difficult with strangers. This one has a sore near the right shoulder, she said, gesturing to the larger of the work horses, a bay gelding named Thunder that Perry had bought the previous spring. It's not serious yet, but it will be if it isn't poulticed. Perry came over and looked. She was right. He had missed it, which was unusual for him, and the fact that she had caught it in the space of 3 minutes' observation said something he was not yet ready to say aloud. I'll see to it tonight, he said. They walked the pasture after the barn. Walt came out of the small bunkhouse and was introduced, and the old man looked at Anna Bailey with the sharp, appraising look of someone who had watched his employer turn away 6 perfectly decent women, and was not yet convinced this would end differently, but was willing to be surprised. Eli emerged behind him, young and curious, and tipped his hat at Anna with the reflexive admiration of a 20-year-old who had not yet learned to disguise it. Anna shook both their hands and asked Walt about the flood damage with the focused interest of someone who was already thinking about solutions, and Walt answered her with a directness that he had not, as far as Perry could observe, offered to any of the other women. By the time they had walked back toward the house, the sun was past noon, and the air had taken on the dry, warm gold of a Texas October afternoon. At the door, Perry tried again. Miss Bailey, he said, and he was very gentle about it, as he always was, because he had genuine respect for the women Mabel sent and genuine regret that he could not be what they needed. I should say, I'm hungry, Anna said. Would it be all right if I made something? Perry stopped. No one had ever asked that. Not one of the 6 before her had said that sentence. They had waited to be served, or they had expressed polite interest in the kitchen, but not one of them had simply said they were hungry and proposed to do something about it. There's bread and salt pork, he said, slightly off his footing. Is there cornmeal? Yes. Then I'll make cornbread, she said, and walked into the kitchen. Perry stood in the doorway of his own house for a moment, watching a woman he had known for 4 hours move through his kitchen, with the ease of someone who was not performing competence, but simply expressing it. She found the cornmeal on the first shelf she looked at, found the Dutch oven without asking, and built up the fire with a few efficient adjustments, and had the bread started in a time that Perry, who was not slow in a kitchen himself, privately considered impressive. He sat down at the table. He was not entirely sure how that had happened. They ate the cornbread with salt pork, and the last of a jar of pickled tomatoes that Perry had been given by his neighbor, a widow named Mrs. Carver, who grew the best kitchen garden in the county. Anna ate with the frank appetite of someone who had ridden on a train for 2 days and missed several meals, and Perry ate across from her and found himself doing something he almost never did at his own table, which was talking. She asked about the Hereford Cross, and they talked about cattle for a time. She asked about the railroad and what it had done to shipping prices, and they talked about that. She asked how the winter ran in that part of Texas, and he told her about the northern winds that came down from the plains in January and February, the kind that put ice on the stock tank and made the cattle drift southward unless you had good fence lines. She asked if the spring flooding was predictable or random. He said mostly predictable. You could read the rainy season well enough to prepare if you had been watching it for 3 or 4 years. At some point during this conversation, Perry looked up and realized that the afternoon light had shifted. It was getting on toward 4 o'clock. "Where are you staying in town?" he asked. "Mrs. Hurst said there's a boarding house." "There is. Mrs. Caldwell's." A pause. "You're welcome to stay here," he said, and then something in his expression registered that he had said that in a way that could be misread, and he added, "The spare room is made up. It's the second door on the left." Anna looked at him with a calm that he was beginning to understand was not distance but depth. "Thank you," she said. "I'll stay." That was the first night. Perry went to bed in his room at the end of the hall and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what had just happened in a house that had been his alone for 6 years. He was accustomed to being alone in the way that some men become accustomed to a difficult landscape, not loving it exactly, but knowing every inch of it so well that any variation felt like an intrusion. There was a woman asleep in his spare room. That should have felt like an intrusion. It did not feel like an intrusion, which was its own kind of intrusion, and Perry lay awake for a good while with this paradox before he fell asleep. In the morning he woke at 5, as he always did, and came out to find that Anna was already up. She was at the stove with coffee on and the fire built, and she had found the eggs that the 2 chickens in the side yard produced and was scrambling them with a skill that made Perry wonder if she had cooked for a crew. Which she had. As it turned out, she had fed her father's 2 ranch hands for 2 years. She told him, breakfast and supper both, because feeding people well was the most efficient investment of time on a working ranch. "You were running a ranch and a kitchen," Perry said. "Most ranch women do," she said simply. "You were doing it alone." She handed him a plate and looked at him with those gray eyes. "Yes," she said, "it's harder alone." She did not say this with self-pity. She said it with the flat accuracy of someone stating a fact about irrigation or weather, and Perry felt the plain truth of it land somewhere in him and stay there. He ate his breakfast. He went out to work. She came with him. Not in the way that announced itself as an intrusion or a demonstration, but in the way of someone who had work to do and saw work available. Perry was going out to check the far fence line that morning, riding the eastern perimeter of the pasture, and Anna simply saddled one of the horses, not the difficult ones, but the sorrel mare that Perry used for lighter work, and rode with him, and she rode well enough that Walt, who was watching from the corral with the accumulated cynicism of his 60 years, turned to young Eli and said quietly, "That one's different." Eli, who had already formed his own opinion, nodded. The fence line ride took most of the morning. They found 2 broken posts in the northeast corner, where the flood damage had weakened the soil, and Perry pulled the wire and set new posts with the practiced speed of a man who had done this particular task hundreds of times. Anna handed tools without being asked, held the wire with a sure grip, and when they came to the second break, she picked up the post hole digger without being told and started on the hole while he was still working on the first. "You don't have to do that," Perry said. "I know," she said, and kept digging. He looked at her for a moment, this woman in a sensible riding skirt and a worn jacket, working a post-hole digger in his pasture as though she had been doing it all her life, which she very nearly had, and felt something loosen in him that he had been keeping tight for a very long time. He did not say anything. He went back to work. That evening, sitting on the porch after supper, watching the last light go orange over the western grass, Perry said, "You know you don't have to prove anything to me, Miss Bailey." She was in the second chair. There were 2 chairs on that porch, which had always seemed to Perry a slight irony for a man who had not sat in them with anyone for years, with her hands quiet in her lap, looking at the horizon. "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm working. It's what I do. I'm not especially good at pretending to be less than I am for the comfort of someone else's uncertainty." Perry was quiet for a moment. "That's direct," he said. "You've had 6 women come out here who left," she said. "I don't think you turned them away because you didn't like them. I think you turned them away because the conversation you were all having was wrong from the start." They were here to be approved of. That's not how I want to arrive anywhere. The evening was very still around them. In the far pasture, a cow called to her calf, and the call hung in the dry air and faded. "What are you here for, then?" Perry said. Anna turned her head and looked at him, and for the first time something in her expression changed from its steady composure to something more unguarded. "I'm here to see if you're real," she said. "I've been managing and planning and surviving for 2 years, and I did it well, but I was very alone, and I'm tired of being alone. I'm not desperate about it, but I want a real life with a real person, and I'm willing to work for it." She paused. "The question is whether you're willing to let someone work alongside you, or whether you've decided you'd rather just be the only one." Perry was silent for a long time after that. The stars came out above the Texas plains one by one, the way they do in that country, suddenly and without ceremony, as if they had been there all along and the darkness had just finally made them visible. "I was married before," he said. It came out of him in the quiet way of something that has been held for a very long time and has finally found a door. "In Missouri. Her name was Clara. She died in childbirth, the baby as well." He stopped. 4 years ago." Anna did not say she was sorry, which would have been the polite thing but would have been a door-closing kind of words. She said, "What was she like?" And Perry, who had not spoken of Clara to anyone in Colton Creek in 6 years, not even to Walt, who had known enough not to ask, told her. He talked about a woman who had been bright and determined and had loved a good argument and had laughed in a way that filled a room, and Anna listened with a stillness that was not passive but active, the kind of listening that is itself a gift. When he finished, there was a long quiet. "I understand why you've been sending everyone away," Anna said at last. "But I need you to understand something in return." She looked at the stars rather than at him, which somehow made what she was going to say easier to hear. "Loving someone who died doesn't mean you're not allowed to love someone who's alive. It's not a betrayal, it's just the rest of your life." Perry looked at his own hands for a long time. "I know," he said quietly. "But knowing it and believing it aren't the same thing," she said, and she was not unkind about it. She was simply honest. "You don't have to believe it tonight," she added. "I'm not going anywhere." Perry looked at her then sharply, as if testing whether she meant it. "I noticed," he said. For the first time, Anna Bailey smiled at him. A real smile, not the polite expression she had been deploying throughout the day, but something genuine and a little rueful and surprisingly warm. It changed her face considerably. It made her beautiful in the way that honesty makes things beautiful. Perry looked away before he was caught staring. The third day was a Sunday, and Perry did not work the ranch on Sundays as a general rule, though he would not have said he kept the Sabbath in any deeply religious sense. It was more that he believed in rest the way he believed in rain, as a practical necessity for anything living. After morning chores, he and Anna rode into Colton Creek together, and the town, which was the size of town where everyone noticed everything, noticed. The men at the feed store noticed. The women outside the church noticed. Mabel Hurst, who happened to be crossing the main street, noticed, and felt a warmth in her chest that she did not permit herself to express until she had turned the corner. They went to the general store together, which was where Perry did his weekly supply run. Anna walked the shelves with the eye of someone who was thinking about a pantry, which Perry noted without commenting on. She picked up a small jar of dried rosemary, the kind of detail that none of the previous women had looked at in the general store, and put it in the basket. And when Perry looked at it, she said, "It does remarkable things for roasted potatoes," with such matter-of-fact conviction that Perry found himself almost smiling. They were in the dry goods aisle when a woman named Ruth Simmons came around the corner with her 2 children in tow, and stopped with the visible delight of someone who had just witnessed something they intended to discuss at length. Ruth was 40 and cheerful and not at all subtle about her curiosity. "Perry Abbott," she said, with great satisfaction. "Is this?" She looked at Anna with open appraisal that was friendly rather than hostile. "Anna Bailey," Anna said, extending her hand, "from Abilene." "Ruth Simmons," Ruth said, shaking it. "It is wonderful to meet you." She looked at Perry with an expression that communicated several volumes of meaning. Perry received these volumes with his usual composure and said nothing. "How do you find the ranch?" Ruth asked. "It's good land," Anna said. "The house is well built. The cattle are healthy." "She means, is it agreeable?" Perry said quietly, and Anna looked at him with a flash of humor in her eyes. "It's very agreeable," she said to Ruth, with a sincerity that Ruth immediately perceived and filed away for later discussion with approximately 7 other people. On the ride back to the ranch in the early afternoon, they were quiet for a stretch, the horses moving at an easy pace through the warm October day. A hawk circled high above the western ridge, and the distant sound of cattle carried on the light breeze, and Perry rode alongside Anna Bailey and thought about something that he had not thought about in 4 years, which was the future. Not the future of the ranch, which he thought about constantly, the spring calves and the market prices and the fence repairs and the water levels. The other kind of future, the kind with another person in it. It was terrifying. He did not intend to let her know that. "You mentioned your father's ranch," he said. "Did you have help after he died?" "One man, old Jim Hooper, who had been with my father for 12 years. He stayed for the first year, then went to his daughter in Kansas." She paused. "The second year I did it with a seasonal hand and whatever extra I could get when the cattle needed moving. It was manageable." Another pause. "I cried in the barn more than I would care to admit." The honesty of it, offered so simply, caught him completely off guard. Perry looked at her profile against the wide sky and felt something turn over in his chest with a slow, deliberate weight. "You sold for a fair price," he said, because he did not know what else to say. "Good enough." A slight smile at the corner of her mouth. "I'm not destitute, Mr. Abbott. I had a choice. I chose this." "Why Texas?" he said. She turned her head and looked at him directly. "Because Mrs. Hurst wrote me a letter about a man with good land and a good reputation who was impossible to convince, and I thought, that sounds like someone worth the effort." Perry looked back at the road ahead. He was quiet for a beat. "That is a disturbing way to choose a destination," he said. Anna laughed. It was the first time she had laughed outright, and it was a good laugh, clear and uncomplicated, and it landed in the air between them like something bright. Perry kept his eyes on the road and his expression even, but the corner of his mouth moved. "It's worked out reasonably well so far," she said. The week went on. Perry had not asked her to stay past the first night and had not asked her to leave, which was its own kind of answer. They fell into a rhythm that seemed to Perry both unprecedented and oddly natural, as if the ranch had been waiting for a second set of hands and had simply been too polite to mention it. Anna was up with him at 5. She cooked, and he appreciated it and said so plainly, because Perry Abbott was not a man who withheld a genuine compliment. He worked the ranch and she worked alongside him, not as a hand exactly, but as someone who had grown up on working land and understood what needed doing and did it without requiring instruction. Walt watched all of this with a quiet, careful attention. On the 4th day he found a moment when Perry was cleaning tack in the barn and said, without preamble, "She knows what she's doing." "I know," Perry said. "The horses like her. I know. The northeast pasture idea about the fallow ground was the right call. I told you the same thing 2 months ago." "I know," Perry said again. Walt was quiet for a moment. "She ain't going," he said, and it was not quite a question. Perry worked the bridle in his hands for a while. "She says she isn't," he said. "You believe her?" Perry thought about the post-hole digger and the breakfast and the way she had asked what Clara was like. He thought about a woman who had cried in a barn alone for a year, and then sold her land and come 600 miles to an impossible man's impossible ranch and gone to work without waiting to be asked. "Yes," he said. Walt nodded once, as if this was the most important thing anyone had told him all year, and went back to his work. On the 5th day, a problem arose that had nothing to do with the ranch. Perry came in from the eastern pasture at midday to find a man named Doyle Ritter sitting on the porch. Doyle was a land agent who had been operating out of Colton Creek for 2 years, and who had made it his particular business to acquire parcels of difficult land from ranchers who were running short on cash and long on patience. He had a legal right to be on the road. The road was public, but had no particular right to be on the porch, though he was smiling as if he did. "Abbott," he said, with the easy confidence of a man who believed charm was a universal solvent. "Just thought I'd stop in and renew our conversation about the East 40. "The conversation is the same as it was," Perry said, stopping at the base of the porch steps. "The East 40 is not for sale." "I'm prepared to improve the offer," Doyle said. "The answer doesn't change with the price." Doyle's smile did not shift, but his eyes moved to Anna, who was standing in the doorway with a practical expression that communicated her feelings about this visit with considerable efficiency. "I don't believe I've had the pleasure," he said. "No," Anna said, "you haven't." Doyle looked from Anna to Perry and back, and his expression recalibrated with the speed of a man who had very good social instincts. "Well," he said pleasantly, standing, "I'll leave you to it. The offer stands, Abbott. Think on it." He tipped his hat to Anna. "Ma'am," he rode out. Perry watched him go. "Does he come often?" Anna asked. "Often enough," Perry said. "He's been after the East 40 for a year. There's a water access issue that makes my land more valuable to his plans than he admits." "The spring," Anna said immediately. Perry looked at her. "The spring," he confirmed. "He won't stop at one, no," she said. "He never has." Perry came up the porch steps and looked out at the road where Doyle Ritter's dust was still settling. "But the land's not for sale, and he can't compel a sale if I don't want one. Law's clear enough on that." "Law's only as clear as the man enforcing it," Anna said. "Who's the sheriff here?" "Holt Davies. He's straight." Perry paused. "I'm not worried about Ritter. He's ambitious, but he's not illegal." "Not yet," Anna said. And Perry looked at her again with the thoughtful expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of agreement. That evening they sat on the porch again, which had become a kind of ritual, and Perry found that he was looking forward to it in a way that unsettled him because it was simple and domestic, and he had not let himself want simple domestic things in a long time. The stars were out again, the sky enormous and particular in the way it was in that open country. "Can I ask you something?" Perry said. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you leave on the first day, or the second?" He was looking at the sky as he said it. "Every other woman Mabel sends them out. I'm polite, they leave. I'm not sure exactly what I do, but apparently it works consistently." Anna was quiet for a moment. "You were kind and you were distant and you were waiting for me to make leaving seem like my own idea," she said. "I recognized it because I've done it myself. When you don't want to need something, you make it easy for it to leave." The silence that followed was the most significant one yet. Perry sat very still. "I'm not a thing that's going to leave because you make it easy," Anna continued. "I know what I came here for and I know what I'm looking at. You have something worth building with. I'd like to build it. And I think you'd like that too if you'd let yourself." Perry did not say anything for a long time. The night sounds of the ranch settled around them, the distant cattle, the creak of the porch, a coyote somewhere far off on the flats. "I'm afraid," he said at last, very quietly. It cost him something to say it. She could hear that it did. "I know," she said. "That makes sense." She did not try to talk him out of it, or reassure him with promises, or tell him that everything would be different this time. She just said it made sense and let him have his fear without making it shameful. Perry turned and looked at her, and in the starlight she looked back at him with those steady, clear eyes, and he saw in her face something that he had been half afraid he would see since the first morning in the kitchen, the complete absence of performance. She was not being brave. She was not being patient. She was simply being fully herself, on his porch, in his evening, in his life, and she was not planning to stop. "Anna," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and they both heard the difference it made. "Perry," she said back and smiled at him. He reached over and took her hand where it lay on the armrest of the chair, just her fingers in his, and held it, and did not let go. The following 2 weeks moved with the particular quality that falls over time when it has become precious, each day distinct and full, the way days are when you are paying attention to them because you can't afford not to. The ranch work continued, and the rhythm of it deepened between them. Anna proved, over the course of those days, to be not merely competent but genuinely gifted with the horses. And Perry, who loved his horses with a quiet intensity that he rarely displayed, noticed this with an appreciation that went beyond the practical. He watched her with the big bay gelding, the one she had identified the soreness in on the first day, who had now been properly treated and was sound again, and had developed an unmistakable preference for Anna that his working relationship with Perry had never quite matched. "That horse has always been difficult," Perry told her one morning, watching her brush the gelding in the bright November sun. "He was in pain," Anna said simply. "Pain makes everyone difficult." Perry looked at her steadily. She kept brushing the horse, and then she looked up and met his eyes, and they both understood that they were not only talking about the horse. Mabel Hurst came out to the ranch on a Saturday in the second week, with the transparent excuse of having supplies to deliver, which she did, but which she could have had Walt pick up, and she was received on the porch with coffee and some of Anna's cornbread, and the sight of Perry Abbott sitting in a chair, and looking like a man who had recently discovered that he had been living in a room with the curtains permanently drawn, and was now experiencing natural light. Mabel stayed for an hour and kept her expression professionally neutral throughout, though when she climbed back onto her buckboard, she permitted herself, in the privacy of the road, a smile of such profound satisfaction that her horse turned around to look at her. On a cool Tuesday morning in the third week, when November had arrived with its dry north wind, and the cattle had been moved to the south pasture for better shelter, Perry found himself in the barn alone with a task he had been putting off for reasons he was only now admitting to himself. He took down a small wooden box from the shelf above his workbench, the kind of box that had no particular use assigned to it, but that had clearly been put somewhere specific for a reason. He opened it. Inside was a silver ring, plain and simple, that had belonged to Clara. He sat with it for a while in the slant of cold light coming through the barn door. He thought about Clara with the full, honest grief that he had mostly been managing at a careful distance for 4 years. He thought about who she had been and what she had meant, and how her loss had hollowed him out to a shell that he had then, with considerable industry, armored in courtesy and distance, and the endless demanding work of the ranch. He thought about how that armor had served him and how it had also cost him, and he thought about a woman who had ridden 600 miles and picked up a post-hole digger in his pasture and sat on his porch in the dark and said, without flinching, that loving someone who died was not a betrayal of someone who was alive. He closed the box. He put it back on the shelf. He did not put it away further. He left it where he could see it because he understood now that it did not need to be hidden. It was part of him, part of his story, and Anna already knew the story and had not run from it. He was not replacing anything. He was, as she had said, living the rest of his life. He went to find her. She was in the side yard with Eli, who was struggling with a feed system that kept jamming, and she had somehow already diagnosed the problem and was explaining the solution with the patient clarity of someone who has taught things before. Eli was listening with the focus of a student who has just realized their teacher actually knows more than they do, which was a look he had been wearing with some frequency around Anna Bailey. Perry watched from across the yard. The cold wind came out of the north and moved through Anna's hair, which she had pinned up this morning but was gradually losing the argument with the weather, and she pushed a strand of it back with the back of her wrist and kept explaining. And Perry stood in his own yard and felt something complete itself inside him, quietly and without ceremony, the way the right things usually happen. He walked over. "When you have a moment," he said to Anna. She looked at him. Something in his voice or his face told her this was a different kind of request than the usual working ones. "Now," she said to Eli, "you see the problem and you see the fix. You can do that yourself." "Yes, ma'am," Eli said, with the confidence of someone who had just been given genuine credit. Anna walked with Perry to the far side of the barn, out of Eli's line of sight. The north wind pushed against them, and the sky overhead was high and cold and brilliant blue. Perry stopped and looked at her and then looked away at the middle distance and then looked back at her, because this was harder than any amount of ranch work. "I want to ask you something," he said. Anna waited. I'm not a man who says things easily." He stopped, started again. "You know that." "I do," she said. "I know you came out here because Mabel sent you, and I know what you said about wanting a real life with a real person, and I want you to know that He stopped again, and there was such unguarded effort in his face that Anna's heart turned over cleanly. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not on account of me making it easy, but not on account of anything else either. I want you here because he looked at her with those dark eyes and said it plainly, because this week and a half has been more alive than the last 4 years, and I think you know that, and I don't want to waste whatever time I've got left being the man who sends everyone away." Anna looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Perry Abbott, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm trying to," he said. She laughed that good clear laugh, and then she stepped forward and took his face in both her hands, the gesture so direct and unhesitating that it undid him completely, and she said, "Yes, obviously yes." He kissed her, and it was the first time, and the cold wind moved around them, and the horses in the barn shifted and stamped, and somewhere out in the south pasture the cattle moved, and the ranch went on, indifferent to large human moments in the way that good land always is. When they came apart, she was still holding his face, and he had both hands at her waist, and they were both laughing slightly, the way people laugh when something they have been afraid to want has turned out to be exactly what it is. "Obviously yes," he repeated. "Obviously yes," she confirmed. "They told Walt first because Walt had been there from the beginning and he deserved to know first." The old man listened to Perry's brief, factual announcement with his arms crossed and his face arranged in its default expression of skeptical weathering, and then he looked at Anna and said, "Good," in a tone that contained approximately 40 different feelings compressed into one syllable, and went back to his work. Eli, when told, looked as if he might fall over with happiness, and shook Perry's hand 3 times and said congratulations in 3 different ways, which was sweet and slightly exhausting. Mabel Hurst, when informed by a visit to her back room the following day, went very still for a moment, put both hands flat on her desk, looked at Anna Bailey with the expression of someone who has just seen 6 years of effort vindicated in a single confirmation, and said, "I knew it from the letter," which was true, though she had not known precisely how it would happen. "You should know," Anna told her, "that if you had sent someone less stubborn it wouldn't have worked." "I know that," Mabel said. "That's why I sent you." They were married 6 weeks later in the Methodist church with the leaking roof, on a cold December morning that was bright and clear. The church was not large, but it was full, because Perry Abbott was liked in Colton Creek even if he was not well understood, and Anna Bailey had been in town long enough and been direct enough with enough people that she had acquired, in the particular way of people who are genuinely good at being themselves, a small but loyal audience. Ruth Simmons cried with spectacular efficiency. Walt stood in the back row of the church looking like a man who had arranged his face carefully against the possibility of displaying any softness, and was not entirely succeeding. Anna wore a dress she had made from fabric bought at the general store, a deep blue-gray that was the color of her eyes in certain lights, and Perry wore his best coat, which was dark wool, and had been brushed within an inch of its life by Eli that morning. The minister said the words. Perry said his with the quiet precision of a man who means every syllable he speaks. Anna said hers with the same clear, steady voice she brought to everything. And when they were done and Perry kissed his wife for the first time in front of God in Colton Creek, Ruth Simmons cried with renewed vigor, and even Walt's jaw moved in a way that suggested feeling. The wedding supper was at the ranch, which was warm with firelight and more people than it had ever held neighbors who brought food and stayed longer than they planned, because the particular warmth of genuine happiness is hospitable to lingering. Anna moved through it all with the easy grace of someone who was entirely at home, which she was, and Perry moved alongside her, and was seen for perhaps the first time by most of the people present as something other than the reserved rancher who kept to himself. He was seen as a man who was happy, which was a different and more interesting thing. Doyle Ritter appeared briefly at the supper, having apparently decided that a social occasion was a good moment to reopen the conversation about the East 40. Perry saw him the moment he walked in and crossed the room to meet him before he could get close to Anna. "Doyle," he said pleasantly. "Congratulations," Doyle said with his easy smile. "I wondered if we might—" "Not tonight," Perry said, with the same pleasantness and a firmness that left no room at all. Doyle looked at him, recalibrated, nodded, and found somewhere else to be. Perry returned to his wife, who had watched this exchange from across the room with the corner of her mouth doing something quiet and approving. "The East 40, she said when he reached her. "The East 40, he confirmed. "We should talk to Holt Davies," she said, with the measured practicality she brought to all problems. "Just to document the pattern. If he's been at this for a year, there's likely a paper trail of offers that establishes intent." "Already thinking about legal strategy at our wedding supper," Perry said, and the tone of his voice when he said it, warm and slightly amused and unmistakably proud, made Anna look up at him with a smile that did things to him that he was still, even now, only beginning to be comfortable admitting. "Somebody has to," she said. He took her hand and held it, and they stayed like that for the rest of the evening. The winter settled in around the ranch with its usual severity, the north winds bringing icy mornings and hard frozen ground that made the daily work a test of endurance and preparation. But the ranch had been prepared by a man who had run it alone for 6 years and was now no longer alone, and there was a quality to that winter that Perry would remember for the rest of his life. The quality of being inside it with someone, the way the cold outside makes the warmth inside particular and intentional. Anna proved to be exactly what she had presented herself as, which was itself notable, because Perry had learned long ago that most things required adjustment between their reputation and their reality. Anna had no such gap. She was capable, direct, warm in the specific way of people who are not generally sentimental, but who love the things they love with complete and unhidden conviction. She was funny in a dry, precise way that made Perry's shoulders shake with silent laughter more than once when he had not been expecting it. She was demanding of herself in the way that people who grew up with land and responsibility often are, and occasionally had to be gently pointed out that she was not, in fact, required to do everything herself now that she was no longer doing things alone. "You have 2 ranch hands," Perry said one February morning, coming out to the barn to find her already halfway through a task that had been on his list for the afternoon. "I'm already here," she said. "You were up at 4 doing the feed." The horses were restless. "Anna," she stopped and looked at him. He came over and took the tool out of her hands and set it aside and held both her hands in his and said, with the particular patient directness that she had once described as his best quality, "You are allowed to let other people do things. This ranch has enough work for all of us. You do not need to earn your place here." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her face shifted, a small, telling shift. "I know," she said. "Do you?" He said, not harshly. She let out a breath. 2 years of running things alone makes a habit," she said. "A bad one, possibly. A reasonable one that you no longer need," he said. He lifted her hands and looked at them, red-knuckled from the cold morning work, strong, capable hands, and then looked back at her face. "I've got you," he said simply. "You can let me have you." It was a simple thing to say. It was not a simple thing to mean, and she knew he meant it, which was why her eyes went bright for a moment before she composed herself and nodded. "All right," she said. "Good," he said, and kissed her between the eyes in that brisk, warm way he had developed in the first weeks of marriage that she had realized she loved past all proportion to its smallness. In March, as the frost broke and the land began its slow brown return to green, they dealt with the matter of Doyle Ritter. He had made 2 more visits to the ranch through the winter, both times when Perry was out on the range, and both times Anna had met him at the door with the calm, unhurried politeness of someone who has no intention of being moved and has all day to prove it. He had been charming. He had been persistent. He had made an offer that was, she privately admitted to Perry that evening, genuinely good. "Does it change your answer?" Perry said. "No," she said. "Does it change yours?" "No." He looked at the fire for a moment. "But we should do as you said, talk to Holt." They went to Sheriff Davies the following week and laid out the pattern of visits and offers with the methodical detail that Anna, who had a good memory and had been keeping a private record, was able to provide. Holt Davies was a lean, careful man of 50 who had been the law in Colton Creek for 8 years and had seen most of what the territory could produce. He listened to their account without interrupting, asked 3 specific questions, and then said that there was nothing currently illegal in Ritter's behavior, but that he understood their concern and would make a point of being visible on the roads west of town more often than he had been. "He's not a man who pushes against open resistance," Holt said. "He works the edges. Make your resistance obvious enough and he'll find somewhere else to put his energy." "We can do that," Anna said. "One more thing," Holt added, looking at Perry with the sideways expression of a man who is about to say something that is not strictly his business. "You should file a formal notice of your property boundaries and water rights at the county seat in Waco. It's a trip, but it's worth it." A man like Ritter respects documented lines more than spoken ones. Perry and Anna made the trip to Waco in April, 3 days' ride through the spring greening country, and it was the first time they had been away from the ranch together, just the 2 of them, and it had a quality of adventure and ease combined that Perry had not experienced since he was young and did not know yet how much things could hurt. They filed the documents and had a supper at a proper restaurant in Waco, the nicest one they could find, which was not very nice but had white tablecloths and candles, and Perry watched Anna across the table and thought that he was, in some fundamental and irrevocable way, the luckiest man he had ever known. "What are you thinking?" she said, because she had learned to read his silences well enough to know when one of them was significant. "I'm thinking about something Walt said to me once," he said. "He said the best thing about good land is that it keeps giving you back more than you put in. He was talking about the ranch." He looked at her steadily. "I think he was only partly talking about the ranch." Anna looked at him for a long, quiet moment and then reached across the white tablecloth and covered his hand with hers. "You're going to have to stop saying things like that," she said, "if you want me to remain composed in public." He turned his hand over and held hers. "I don't especially want you to remain composed in public," he said. She laughed, and the candles flickered in the warm April air, and the restaurant around them continued its ordinary business, completely indifferent to the fact that 2 people at a corner table had just become, quietly and completely, the most important things in each other's lives. They came home to the ranch on a golden April afternoon to find that Walt had kept everything in perfect order and Eli had repaired the South Corral fence that had been on their list for 3 weeks, and the cattle were settled, and the horses were content, and the northeast pasture, left fallow through the winter exactly as Anna had recommended, had come back stronger than either of them had hoped, thick new grass running all the way to the repaired fence line. Perry stood at the edge of it and looked at it for a long moment, and then looked at Anna, who was standing beside him with her arms crossed lightly, and the particular satisfied expression of someone whose judgment has been vindicated by time. "The fallow worked," he said. "It usually does," she said, and he heard, as he always did, the extra layer in what she said, and he smiled. Spring became summer, and the ranch grew under 2 pairs of hands and 2 minds, and it grew differently than it had under one, not merely in the work that got done, but in the quality of the decisions. Perry had always been a good rancher, careful and thorough and patient. Anna brought a complementary cast of mind that was faster to intuit and faster to act, and the combination produced results that neither would have reached alone. The Hereford cross breeding program that Perry had been working on for 2 years accelerated significantly with Anna's input on management and selection, and by July they were looking at a spring calf crop that was 20% heavier than the previous years. Walt watched all of this with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who has been present for the foundation of something and knows it. Eli grew visibly in confidence and capability over those months, under the daily influence of two people who expected competence and provided genuine instruction, and by midsummer Perry was leaving him in charge of the morning work without hesitation. Colton Creek itself continued around them, as small towns do, with its usual mixture of routine and drama. A new family came in from Missouri and bought the old Henderson place 4 miles east, and their arrival brought 2 more children to the school and a wife, Eleanor Grant, who turned out to be one of the finest quilters in the county and became, within 3 months, one of Anna's close friends. Ruth Simmons continued to be warmly invested in everyone's business in the best possible way, and Mabel Hurst continued to operate her matchmaking enterprise, and sent 2 more successful couples into the world before the year was out, though neither of them gave her anything like the satisfaction of Anna Bailey and Perry Abbott. Doyle Ritter, faced with the properly filed water rights documentation and Holt Davies' increased visibility on the western roads, redirected his attentions to a parcel south of town and troubled the Abbott ranch no further. This was noted by everyone involved with the quiet satisfaction that proper preparation deserves. On a hot August evening, with the cicadas loud in the live oaks and the last light going red across the flats, Anna came to find Perry on the porch, their porch now, absolutely and fully theirs, and sat in her chair and looked at the horizon for a moment before she said, with the careful composure of someone who is not certain how news will be received, "I need to tell you something." Perry, who had been looking at the same horizon, turned to look at her. She met his eyes. Her expression was serious but not afraid, and underneath the seriousness was something else, something warm and luminous that he was already reading before she said the words. "We're going to have a child," she said. Perry's face did something that she had never seen it do before, which was go completely unguarded all at once, every layer of reserve dissolving simultaneously. He looked at her with an expression that contained, in approximately equal parts, joy and terror and love so complete and unconditional that her throat closed with it. He reached out and took her hand. He was shaking slightly. She was shaking slightly. They were both shaking slightly on a hot August evening on the porch of their ranch in Colton Creek, Texas, holding on to each other's hands. "Anna," he said. "I'm well," she said immediately, because she knew what he was afraid of and she wanted him to hear it first and hear it clearly. "I'm completely well. I'm healthy. This is a healthy start." She held his hand with both of hers. "We are going to be all right." He looked at her for a long time, working through all the things that were happening in him with a patience and courage that she respected enormously. She did not rush him. She held his hands and waited. "I know," he said at last, and it came out with the steadiness of someone who has found solid ground on the far side of something difficult. "I know we are." He looked at her face, at the warmth in it, at the steadiness she was offering him alongside the news, and he pulled her toward him and held her with his arms around her in the evening air, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and the cicadas continued their absolute song, and the land continued its indifferent, generous existence all around them. "We should tell Walt," she said after a while. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was close. "He'll already know," he said. "He always already knows." He was right. Walt, when told the following morning, said "good" for the second time in a year, with the same compressed density of feeling, and returned to his work. Eli was once again required to express his congratulations multiple times before the morning was out. Mabel Hurst was told over coffee in town, and received the news with what she described afterward, to Eleanor Grant, as the most satisfying professional moment of her career, which was saying something. The pregnancy was, as Anna had promised, healthy. She managed the ranch work through the autumn with the same energy she had brought to it from the beginning, making adjustments to what she took on as the months progressed with the same practical intelligence she applied to everything, not refusing help, which Perry appreciated, but calibrating carefully. Perry was attentive in a way that was not smothering, but was deeply consistent, the kind of attention that is expressed through small daily acts rather than dramatic declaration. He took certain tasks off her list without announcement. He made sure the stove had been hot for a while before she got up in the cold November mornings, so the kitchen was warm when she arrived. He read the agricultural journal articles about safe physical work in pregnancy because he was a thorough person, and he wanted to know what the doctors said. And he relayed the information to Anna without either catastrophizing it or dismissing it, which she found exactly right. He was afraid. She knew he was afraid, and he knew she knew, and they had an honest, unspoken agreement that the fear was not in charge, that it was present and acknowledged but not directing events. In December, on a cold, clear morning exactly 1 year after their wedding, Anna gave birth in their bedroom with the assistance of the town doctor, a competent man named Harland who had delivered most of Colton Creek's children, and Ruth Simmons, who had appointed herself to this role without anyone specifically requesting it, but whose presence turned out to be genuinely useful because she had done this 4 times herself and had a calm, encouraging practicality about it that the medical process benefited from. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and extremely loud about his arrival, which Harlan said was an excellent sign, and he was healthy and large, 7 pounds and 2 ounces. And when Perry came into the room and stood over the bed looking at his son and his wife, he stood very still for a long time and did not say anything, and Anna watched his face go through everything it had to go through and held the baby out to him. Perry took his son. He held him with the careful, deliberate competence of a man who had not held an infant before, but was determined to do this right. And the baby quieted against his chest in the way that babies sometimes do, abruptly, and as if they have found a frequency that suits them. Perry looked down at his son's small red face and then up at his wife, and his face was entirely open in a way that she knew almost no one in Colton Creek had ever seen and might never see, and she looked back at him with absolute love. "Hello," Perry said to his son, very quietly. Not to Anna, not to the room, just to the child in his arms, direct and private and complete. They named him James for Anna's father, with the middle name Walt, because Walt, when informed of this intention, said nothing at all for the longest pause that anyone had observed from him, and then said good for the 3rd time, in a voice that was different from the other 2 times. The years that came after that were full. Not full in the sense of being crowded or rushed, but full in the sense that good land is full, layered and generous and constantly producing. James grew up on the ranch the way ranch children do, which is to say outdoors and early, and with a thorough education in how things actually work. He was an observant child with his mother's eyes and his father's stillness, and by the age of 4, he was following Walt around the barn with the absolute earnest focus of someone receiving wisdom. And Walt, who had long since stopped pretending that he was not profoundly attached to this family, spent more time explaining things to James than he had ever spent explaining things to anyone in his life. The ranch itself expanded in those years. Perry bought the adjacent 40 acres that came up for sale in 1881 from a family returning east, which gave them more grazing land and access to a second seasonal creek that improved their drought resilience considerably. The Hereford crossbreeding program produced a herd line by 1882 that other ranchers in the county were coming to ask about, and Perry sold 2 breeding bulls that year for prices that would have seemed extraordinary to the man who had paid too much for his first 40 acres in 1872. Anna ran the books, which she had insisted on doing from the first year, not because Perry was bad at figures. He was not, but because she was better, which Perry acknowledged with his usual honest practicality. She also ran a small but increasingly productive kitchen garden that she had started in the 2nd year of their marriage, with seeds that Alina Grant and Ruth Simmons had helped her source, and the garden produced enough through the summer to put up considerable stores for winter. She taught these methods to several of the neighboring ranch wives with a generous efficiency, and over time the community of women in the Colton Creek area had a quiet, productive network of shared knowledge and assistance that operated largely independently of the men and was the better for it. In the spring of 1882, when James was 3, they had their second child. A girl this time, born as easily as James had been, and just as loudly opinionated about her arrival. They named her Clara. Perry held his daughter for the first time with the practiced ease of a man who had been holding his son since infancy, and he looked down at her face, and then looked at Anna with an expression that was too full to describe and contained, among many other things, a kind of peace that Anna recognized as the deepest kind, the kind that comes from the past being honored rather than buried. "Clara," he said quietly, "is that all right?" Anna had asked him weeks before when they had discussed names. She had asked it carefully and directly as she asked everything. "It's more than all right," he had said. "It's right." And she had heard in his voice the thing she had said to him on that first porch evening, that loving someone who died is not a betrayal. He had believed her by then. He had believed it for a long time. The morning after Clara was born, Perry came out to the kitchen in the early light and made coffee, and stood at the window that looked west toward the open land. The same window Anna had stood at the morning of her first breakfast in this kitchen, and he thought about the 5 years that had passed since a woman had come out to his ranch and refused to be made to leave. He thought about everything that had happened since that autumn day in 1878. The fence riding and the cornbread and the porch evenings, and the marriage and James and Clara and the expanded herd, and the quiet daily accumulation of a life that was, by any honest measure, extraordinarily good. He heard Anna moving in the bedroom, heard James start his morning conversation with himself in his small room down the hall. The child talked constantly, which both of them found endlessly entertaining, and heard, just barely, the new small sounds of Clara beginning the day. He poured a second cup of coffee and took it to the bedroom. Anna was sitting up with the baby, the morning light coming through the window and lying across them both in a soft, pale line, and she looked up when he came in and reached for the coffee with the grateful urgency of a woman who had been up twice in the night. "Thank you," she said. Perry sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, and then at his wife, and then back at his daughter. James appeared in the doorway, 3 years old and serious about everything, and climbed onto the bed without ceremony and settled himself beside his mother with the possessive comfort of someone who has no doubt about where he belongs. "Baby," James announced, pointing at his sister. "Clara," Perry told him. "Her name is Clara." James considered this. "Clara," he repeated, with the tone of someone filing information for future use. Anna was watching Perry watch their family with an expression on her face that was complete and quiet and full of everything she had come 600 miles to find, and more besides, more than she had known to look for. "Perry," she said. He looked at her. "Are you happy?" She asked, because she asked him this sometimes, directly and without embarrassment, and he had learned to answer it the same way. He looked at the room, at the children, at this woman who had come to his door and refused to be turned away, who had picked up a post-hole digger in his pasture and made cornbread in his kitchen and sat on his porch in the dark and told him the truth about himself until he was ready to believe it. He took her free hand in his and held it. "Completely," he said. Outside, the Texas morning was beginning in its large, indifferent, generous way. The cattle moving in the far pasture, Walt's shadow crossing the barnyard, Eli's voice calling something to the horses, the first wind of the day moving through the long grass that stretched from the spring to the east fence and back again. The land gave and gave and gave, the way it always did when you worked it honestly and tended it with care and let it be what it was. The ranch, which had once been a man alone with his walls and his grief, and his extraordinary talent for remaining politely unavailable to anyone who tried to reach him, was now something different and larger and more alive. It was a place where two people had built something real from the ground up, in the old, unglamorous, daily way that things that last are built. And it would still be there on the next morning and the morning after that, as long as they were willing to keep working it together. James climbed further up the bed and settled himself against his father's side with the absolute trust of a child who has never had reason to doubt his welcome. And Perry put his arm around him and held his wife's hand across the top of his son's small head. And Clara slept against Anna's shoulder with the consuming, perfect unconsciousness of the newly arrived. And the October light of 1883 came through the window in a long gold line across the Abbott family on a Friday morning in Colton Creek, Texas, and there was nothing unresolved, nothing left undone, nothing missing from the picture. Anna had come to see if he was real. He was. He was entirely, completely real, and so was she. And so was this life they had made out of the difficult, generous land of the West with their hands and their patience, and their willingness to stay when staying was the harder thing. Everything, in the end, was exactly as it ought to be.